Welcome back, fellow philosophy enthusiasts, to another deep dive. Today we're going to be grappling with a concept that's, well, pretty fundamental to a lot of philosophical thinking. Monism.
Hmm.
The idea of oneness.
Yeah, the idea that at some level, everything is one.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Now, for those of you who have already spent some time pondering the mysteries of the universe, you've probably moved beyond just asking what is one. The real question is one relative to what?
Right.
Right? Counted by what?
Absolutely. Monism always depends on two things, like what are you counting and how are you counting it?
Right. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, there's always a target. The thing that we're considering is one. And then there's the unit, how we're measuring that oneness.
Exactly. Like, are we saying there's only one kind of stuff in the universe? Or one fundamental entity that everything comes from? Or literally just one single thing, full stop?
Yeah, and to complicate matters further, monism isn't just floating out there by itself. It has these, like, philosophical cousins. Pluralism, which says there are many, and nihilism, which claims none. But, and this is important, all of these stances depend on the target and the unit we're using.
Definitely. For instance, let's take concrete objects as our target. If we're counting by highest type, like the most fundamental category, then a substance monist would argue that there's just one ultimate category for all concrete things. Maybe it's all matter, or maybe it's all mind, but it's just one category.
And a substance pluralist, on the other hand, might be a dualist, right? They'd say there are at least two fundamental categories.
Precisely, like matter and mind.
Right. And then you've got your substance nihilist who just throws up their hands and says concrete objects don't really belong to any highest type at all.
And to make it even more nuanced, you can hold different monistic views for different aspects of reality. Like, you could be a substance monist, believing in one fundamental type of stuff, but also a property dualist, meaning you think there are two fundamentally different types of properties, like physical and mental.
Oh, that's a really interesting point. It shows how you can't just make blanket statements about oneness without being super clear about what you're talking about. But for our deep dive today, we're going to focus on two specific types of monism that have a long history in philosophy, but have also seen, like, a resurgence of interest lately. Existence monism and priority monism.
Yeah, these two often got lumped together and kind of dismissed for a while, but luckily that's changing. There are some really compelling arguments being made, especially for priority monism.
It's fascinating how philosophical inquiry evolves, right?
Yeah.
Like, the initial instinct might be to lean towards pluralism, that there are many things, but then you start digging deeper, asking questions about the ultimate nature of reality, the interconnectedness we see everywhere. And these monistic perspectives start to look more and more appealing.
Absolutely. The more you think about it, the more you realize that many might just be an illusion.
So let's jump in. First up, existence monism.
Yeah.
Here, our target is concrete objects, the things we can touch and interact with. And we're counting them as individual tokens, like separate instances. Now, existence monism makes a pretty bold claim. It says that there's only one concrete object token, just one.
Whoa! One. Like, everything we see and experience is all just one thing.
That's the idea. And this one thing is often equated with the cosmos, the whole universe, or as some philosophers like to call it, the blobject.
Blobject. I kind of like that.
Right. It has a certain ring to it. But think about the implications for a second. If there's truly only one concrete object, then what about all the seemingly distinct things we encounter every day? Our hands, the coffee mugs we're holding, the very devices we're using to record this podcast.
Yeah, good point. If everything is ultimately just one thing, then what about you and me? Are we just parts of the blobject?
Well, that's the challenge for the existence monists, right? They have to explain this apparent multiplicity. And essentially, they have three options. Either one of any two seemingly distinct objects doesn't actually exist, or one of them isn't actually concrete, or in some fundamental sense, they're both actually the same thing.
None of those options really jive with our common sense experience, do they?
Not really. And it's important to emphasize that existence monism isn't just saying that everything is interconnected. It's making a much stronger claim that there's literally only one concrete thing.
Okay, so that's existence monism. It's a pretty radical idea. But now let's move on to priority monism, which, as we'll see, takes a different approach and doesn't necessarily lead to such counterintuitive conclusions.
Right. So priority monism is also focused on concrete objects. But instead of counting individual tokens, it's counting basic tokens.
Basic tokens? What does that mean?
Well, the idea is that there's only one concrete object token that is truly basic, fundamental, and everything else is derived from it. And this basic object is typically identified with the world, the cosmos.
So it's not saying that there's only one thing, but that there's only one fundamental thing.
Exactly. Priority monism acknowledges that there are parts, that there are hands and chairs and people. But it's saying that their ontological status, their fundamental nature, is secondary to the cosmos as a whole.
So it's kind of like a hierarchy, right? The cosmos is at the base and everything else is built upon it.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. The priority in priority monism refers to this hierarchical structure of reality. The whole has a kind of primacy over its parts.
That actually makes a lot more sense than existence monism, at least on the surface.
Right. It doesn't deny that we exist as distinct individuals, but it says that our existence is dependent on the prior, more fundamental existence of the cosmos.
It's a subtle but crucial difference.
Now, before we get into the arguments for these views, our sources do mention a few other forms of monism that are worth knowing about. There's substance monism, which we already touched on, where all concrete objects fall under one top-level category. Then there's genus monism, which goes even further and says there's one ultimate highest category, like being, that everything belongs to. And finally, there's property monism, which claims that all properties are fundamentally of the same type, maybe reducible to physical properties or something like that.
So all these other forms of monism are looking at different aspects of reality categories, properties, and using highest type as their unit of measurement. It just shows how many different ways there are to think about unity in the grand scheme of things.
Definitely. But for our deep dive today, we're sticking with existence monism and priority monism and how they apply to concrete objects. Okay, so let's get into the arguments. Starting with existence monism, the first question a philosopher might ask is, what could possibly make someone think that there's only one concrete thing? It seems so counterintuitive.
Well, one influential argument is the exclusion argument. The basic idea is that the world itself is the only concrete object you actually need to explain everything that happens, all the causes and effects. Like, you can tell the whole story of the universe just by referring to the state of the cosmos and the fundamental laws that govern it.
Okay, I think I see where this is going. If the whole world is doing all the causal heavy lifting, then any individual parts we might want to talk about, like a specific billiard ball hitting another one, become kind of redundant, right? Either they're not really doing anything causally, or they're just mirroring what the world as a whole is doing.
Exactly. So the argument goes, why bother with all these extra entities if we can explain everything with just one? It's like Occam's razor, right? The simplest explanation is usually the best.
So if we want to be ontologically parsimonious, we should just say that there's only one concrete object,
Yeah.
the world.
Precisely. Now, of course, there are counter-arguments to this. A pluralist, someone who believes in many concrete objects, might come back and say, hold on, I need those parts to explain certain things. They might argue that a purely global description of the world just can't capture everything.
Right. They might say you need to talk about specific parts of the world to make sense of certain phenomena. And our source material does point out that some pluralists even go so far as to deny the existence of the world as a concrete object at all.
Yeah, they might have some very specific criteria for what counts as a concrete object, and the world, according to them, just doesn't make the cut.
But that's a pretty extreme view. More commonly, the pluralist might argue that the world isn't actually doing all the causal work, that the parts have their own causal powers. Or they might say that the world is really just the sum of its parts, so it's not like the parts are redundant.
That's the composition as identity thesis, right?
Yeah.
But that has its own problems. It's tough to reconcile the idea of a single thing being identical to many distinct things.
Definitely. And another possible reply from the pluralist is to say, look, maybe we should only be parsimonious when it comes to basic entities. We can be more generous with derivative entities, like parts of the world, even if the world is doing the fundamental causal work.
Which brings us back to the idea of priority monism.
Exactly. Now, another argument for existence monism that we should discuss is the argument from ontological vagueness, put forth by philosophers Horgan and Potra.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting one. They basically argue that the idea of a world full of ordinary, common-sense objects is just too vague. Like, where does one object end and another begin?
Right. They call these vague objects slob objects, which I find kind of funny. And they argue that this vagueness leads to all sorts of logical problems, like not being able to say for sure whether a particular object exists or what its properties are.
So their solution is to ditch the slob objects and go with precise objects, which they call snob objects.
Love the terminology. But then the question becomes, how many snob objects are there? They consider a few options. Nihilism, where there are many tiny, precise objects but no composite wholes. Universalism, where you have the tiny objects plus all their possible combinations, which are also precise. And then, of course, existence monism, which says there's just one huge, precise object. The blobject, now also the snobject.
And they argue that out of all these options, existence monism is the most parsimonious when it comes to precise entities.
But our sources raise some good objections to this line of reasoning. First, they point out that comparing the parsimony of nihilism and existence monism isn't so straightforward. They're talking about completely different kinds of things.
Yeah, it's not just a matter of counting entities.
Right. And then there's the problem of explanatory power. Like, how does the existence monist explain things like reference in language? If there's only one concrete object, what are all our words pointing to?
And how can they even formulate their own theory? They're using language that seems to presuppose the existence of multiple things like sentences and concepts.
Exactly. So the argument from ontological vagueness, while thought-provoking, doesn't seem to be a slam dunk for existence monism.
It does raise some interesting questions about vagueness and precision in our ontology, though.
Definitely. And it leads us nicely back to priority monism, which might be a way to get the parsimony benefits of a unified view without all the counterintuitive baggage of existence monism.
Right. So priority monism, reminder, says that there's only one basic concrete object, the cosmos, and everything else is derived from it. The key here is this concept of basicness. Like, what does it mean for something to be basic, and how does that relate to ontological priority?
Well, the sources explain that basicness is often understood in terms of a hierarchy of reality. You've got the basic level, which is like the foundation, and then you've got the derivative levels built on top of it. The basic entities are the ones that everything else depends on, the ones that everything else exists in virtue of.
Kind of like the foundation of a building. Everything rests on it, and without it, the whole thing would collapse.
Exactly. And this idea of basicness is tied to ontological priority, which is this relationship of dependence between entities. If we assume that ontological priority has to have a starting point, a foundation, then the basic entities are the ones that aren't posterior to anything else. They're not dependent on anything else for their existence.
So when we're talking about concrete objects, a basic concrete object would be one that doesn't have any other concrete object ontologically prior to it.
Right. And within this framework, the debate between priority monism and priority pluralism becomes a debate about what occupies this very bottom level of the hierarchy, the foundation of concrete objects. The monist says it's the cosmos, the whole universe. The pluralist says it's some collection of smaller, subcosmic parts.
One way to visualize this is to think about tiling. Imagine that basic objects tile the cosmos, meaning they make up the whole of reality without any overlap.
Okay, I like that analogy. So in that case, priority monism would say that there's only one tile, the cosmos itself. And priority pluralism would say that there are many smaller tiles that fit together to make up the cosmos.
Exactly. And within this tiling picture, priority monism and priority pluralism become the only two options. You can't have priority nihilism where nothing is basic, because then there wouldn't be any tiles to make up the cosmos.
That's a really helpful way to think about it.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's look at some of the arguments that have been put forward for and against priority monism. Our sources start with the argument from common sense. The idea here is that our everyday intuitions seem to favor priority pluralism, the view that parts are more fundamental than wholes. Like, think about a pile of sand. The individual grains of sand seem to exist before the pile, right?
Right. Or a brick wall. The bricks are there before the wall.
Exactly. But the sources point out that our common sense actually recognizes genuine unities as well, things that aren't just loose collections of parts, like a living organism, or maybe even the cosmos itself.
Yeah, you wouldn't say that the heart or the lungs exist before the organism, would you?
Right. So common sense might not be as straightforwardly pluralistic as it seems. And the priority monists can argue that the cosmos, with all its interconnectedness and apparent unity, is more like a genuine unity than a mere aggregate.
That's an interesting point. I never thought of the cosmos as a genuine unity before.
Now, another argument that's been made for priority monism comes from quantum mechanics, specifically the phenomenon of quantum entanglement.
Oh, entanglement. That's where two particles are linked together in a way that transcends space and time, right?
Exactly. And the argument from quantum emergence says that because of entanglement, the cosmos as a whole might exhibit emergent properties, properties that aren't reducible to the properties of its parts, even when you consider all the parts together.
So the whole is literally more than the sum of its parts in this case.
Right. And the argument goes, if the whole has these emergent properties, then the whole must be ontologically prior to its parts. It can't be the other way around.
But couldn't a pluralist argue that entanglement is just a relationship between particles, not a property of the whole system?
They could try, and our sources do mention that as a possible reply. But it gets pretty complicated delving into debates about the nature of mereological supervenience and whether relations should be included in the supervenience base.
Oh,
Definitely. Now, shifting gears a bit, there's also the argument from atomless gunk.
gunk. What's that?
Gunk is a philosophical term for a situation where every part of a whole has further proper parts, and this goes on infinitely. So there are no ultimate indivisible atoms. It's just parts all the way down.
Okay, I get it. Everything is made of smaller things, and those smaller things are made of even smaller things, and so on.
Exactly. And the argument for priority monism from Gunk is a modal argument. It's about what's necessary across all possible worlds. The idea is that the direction of ontological priority parts before wholes, or wholes before parts, should be a necessary truth, something that's true in all possible scenarios.
Okay, I'm following.
So the argument says, imagine a gunky world, a world where there are no fundamental parts. If priority pluralism were a necessary truth, then in this gunky world there would be nothing to be ontologically basic, which seems problematic. Therefore, the argument concludes, the ultimate whole, the cosmos, must be basic in all possible worlds.
Interesting. So, because we can conceive of a world without fundamental parts, the only option for something to be ontologically basic is the cosmos itself.
Precisely. And since our world might be gunky, or at least we can't rule it out, priority monism sounds like the safer bet. Now, a pluralist might try to counter this by saying, well, what about worldless junk? Junk is the opposite of gunk, where every whole is a proper part of some larger whole going on infinitely upwards.
So no ultimate parts and no ultimate whole.
Exactly. But our sources point out that junk is a much harder concept to make sense of than gunk. It leads to some weird logical paradoxes.
So the argument from Gunk, while not definitive, does provide some support for priority monism.
Okay, another challenge for priority monism comes from the argument from heterogeneity. The idea here is that fundamental entities should be homogeneous, meaning they're internally uniform. And since the world is clearly heterogeneous, full of all sorts of different things, it can't be fundamental.
So the pluralist can say, look, my fundamental parts can be homogeneous, and they can differ from each other, which explains why the world as a whole is heterogeneous.
Right. But the priority monist has some clever replies to this.
Yeah.
They might say, well, even in a pluralistic ontology, you could still end up with heterogeneity all the way down. Or they might propose ways in which a fundamental whole could be heterogeneous without contradicting itself.
Like what?
Well, one way is through distributional properties. So maybe the cosmos has a kind of polka dot pattern of fundamental
The
properties.
polka dot cosmos. I like it.
Right. Or they might say that properties are relationalized. So the cosmos is fundamentally red in one region and fundamentally green in another.
Mm.
Or they might regionalize instantiation. So fundamental redness is instantiated in a herely way, and fundamental greenness is instantiated in a verily way.
Okay. I'm not sure I fully understand those last two, but I get the general idea. They're trying to show that heterogeneity doesn't automatically rule out a fundamental whole.
Exactly. Then there's the argument from intrinsicness, which draws on the work of philosopher Ted Sider. It starts with the intuition that there's a real difference between intrinsic and extrinsic properties. Like, the shape of a ball is intrinsic, but its location is extrinsic.
Okay, that makes sense.
So the argument goes, if subcosmic objects have intrinsic properties, then they must have fundamental properties. And if they have fundamental properties, then priority monism must be false, because it says that only the cosmos is fundamental.
But doesn't that depend on how you define intrinsic?
It definitely does.
Yeah.
And our sources point out that the definitions of intrinsicness that are often used in this argument actually presuppose the fundamentality of parts.
So the monist could just say, hey, your definition is biased against my view.
Exactly. Or they could try to offer a different definition of intrinsicness that's compatible with priority monism. Or they could argue that the standard definitions are problematic anyway, even if you're not a monist.
It seems like this whole debate about intrinsicness gets pretty tangled up with the nature of properties and fundamentality.
It really does. And speaking of tangled, there's also the argument from free recombination, which links priority pluralism to the idea that basic units of being should be loose and separate, able to be combined and recombined in different ways to form different possible worlds.
So if we don't see that kind of free recombination in our world, it might suggest that things are more fundamentally interconnected, which would favor monism.
Right, But the sources also point out that it's not clear that priority monism necessarily rules out all forms of recombination. And it gets into some thorny issues about modality and whether there are any necessary connections in reality.
Big questions.
Huge questions. Now, another argument for priority monism is the argument from nomic integrity. This one focuses on the fact that the cosmos seems to be governed by a unified set of laws, like the laws of physics.
So the cosmos is evolving as a single integrated system.
Exactly. And that suggests that the cosmos itself is the primary thing, the basic object that's evolving according to these laws.
Okay, I can see that. But couldn't a pluralist say that their basic objects are also evolving according to those same laws?
They could, and they might also bring up the possibility of island universes, completely separate systems with their own laws. But the priority monists can respond that our cosmos is the one we actually observe evolving according to our specific laws, which gives some support to their view.
Makes sense.
Now, finally, there are these modal thought experiments called cut-and-paste arguments that try to show that priority monism leads to contradictions.
Oh, I've heard of those. Like, imagine you take our cosmos and stick it inside a bigger world. If priority monism is true, then our cosmos would become non-fundamental, which seems weird.
Right. Or imagine you cut out a part of our cosmos and create a new, smaller world.
Mm.
Now it seems like the parts are prior to the whole, contradicting priority monism.
Tricky.
Very tricky. But the priority monist has ways of responding to these arguments. They might question whether fundamentality has to be an intrinsic property that stays the same across all duplicates and contexts.
It seems like there's always another layer to these arguments.
There really is, and that's kind of the point. This whole debate about priority monism is still very much alive and kicking. There's no clear winner yet.
It's exciting, though, to see how much progress has been made in recent years.
Absolutely. Priority monism, after being somewhat neglected for a while, is now a serious contender in metaphysics. It hasn't been refuted, and there are some very compelling arguments in its favor.
It makes you think about the world in a whole new way.
It really does. So, to wrap up our deep dive today, we hope we've given you a better understanding of the different types of monism, especially the difference between existence monism, which is there's only one concrete thing, and priority monism, which says there's one fundamental concrete thing. And while existence monism faces some pretty big challenges, priority monism, with its focus on the unity of the cosmos and the derivative status of its parts, is a sophisticated and increasingly influential view.
It's definitely a view that deserves more attention.
Absolutely. And as our sources emphasize, there's still a lot of philosophical work to be done in this area. Lots of open questions and new arguments to be explored.
It's a fertile ground for philosophical inquiry.
As a final thought for you to ponder, after hearing all these arguments for and against priority monism, what do you find most convincing? Do you think reality is ultimately one or many at the fundamental level? And how do our everyday experiences fit into that picture? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, keep on philosophizing.